So if the existing conversation around either unilaterally or multilaterally electrifying everything and going renewable is the wrong conversation to have in this state of emergency, what is the right conversation to have?
For me, I've looked at this very carefully. I think we need to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at gigaton scale. You say gigaton, it's a billion tons. You say it really quick, but it's a mind-blowing amount of material. Right now, humanity is adding about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year. About 10 of those gigatons are absorbed by land, carbon sinks on land, and especially in the ocean. If we could expand the ability of land and especially the oceans to absorb carbon dioxide, we could reach net zero much more quickly. People have some familiarity with this idea because everybody knows that if you plant the trees absorb carbon dioxide. So you get these forestation projects around the world that help a little bit. But as you research this more and more, you realize that there's just not enough land. Like if you do the math, in order to absorb all the extra carbon dioxide that we are emitting on land, you would have to turn something around the size of all of Canada into tropical forest. And there's just not enough land for that. You would displace a huge amount of agriculture. People would go hungry. You would displace, it's simply not practicable. So it doesn't really work. So then the question is, if you can't do it on land, well, where can you do it? Where does photosynthesis work at scale? It's in the oceans, right? So, I work at the Anthropocene Institute right now. We deal with a lot of these projects. The center of our concern right now is looking at photosynthesis in the ocean as a potential way of absorbing this extra carbon dioxide.
How would that work?
Well, there are several different approaches. The one that we're most interested in is inspired by this research project that came out of a French research team in the South Pacific. It's published in Science in 2023. They found these undersea vents, like hydrothermal vents. They look like little volcanoes under the ocean that are shallow. So they're adding chemicals to surface waters. And what is it mostly is phosphate and iron, stuff that's in the Earth's mantle. It turns out that these these subsea vents fertilize very large blooms of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are just tiny marine plants, right? They're microscopic. You can't see them without a microscope. But they absorb carbon dioxide. They're the base of the food chain in the ocean. And there are very large numbers of them around the world. Except in the center of the Earth's oceans, if you're very far from land, it turns out that you don't get enough dust deposition from the continents to fertilize these phytoplankton blooms. So the center of the Earth's oceans tend to be very low in phytoplankton, and they don't absorb nearly as much carbon dioxide as they could. This undersea vent in Tonga fertilizes a phytoplankton patch the size of Germany. Okay, it's 360,000 square kilometers, and it's absorbing 15 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's millions. We need to get to billions. We need to get to gigaton scale. But it's like we see it as a kind of natural pilot project, a natural experiment where nature is showing us how we could move towards a solution that doesn't require 192 countries to agree and sign on the dotted line, where some countries in the South Pacific, which are among the most exposed to climate change in the world, could take a lead in saying, well, we can develop our natural carbon sinks, we can imitate what nature does, and we can use this as a nature-based solution. It's using phytoplankton, which is the kind of being that initially put oxygen into the atmosphere in the first place. It's the reason we have oxygen to begin with. So it's there. We want to study.
And do you need to seed phytoplankton, or are you merely fertilizing existing tracts of the ocean for the existing phytoplankton to flourish?
Yeah, no, you don't need to seed anything. The phytoplankton is there. It's just not there in concentrations high enough to absorb enough carbon dioxide, right? So what's interesting about this is that this, in principle, could work in most of the world's oceans. It could work in the North Atlantic and the in the North Pacific and the South Pacific. It could work in the Indian Ocean, and it could work in the South Atlantic Ocean. It couldn't work in the North Atlantic. And the reason why is quite interesting is that the North Atlantic is already naturally fertilized by dust from the Sahara. So there's this thing called the Saharan air layer, which is a layer of dust bearing air picked up from the Sahara that actually covers most of the North Atlantic. And there's a reason the North Atlantic on a per unit basis captures about twice as much carbon dioxide as there's other oceans. There's just more life in the North Atlantic. There's always been very rich fisheries in the North Atlantic for this reason. So really the proposal that we're thinking, if we think 5-10 years out, is, well, what if we could bring the world's other oceans to the level of phytoplankton productivity that the North Atlantic already has? We're not talking about something that would necessarily be a visible change, like to the naked eye, it would just look the same. You would just have livelier ocean ecosystems in these 4 other oceans. You probably, it's hard to say for sure, but common sense indicates that if you have more phytoplankton, you would also have more of all kinds of marine life, zooplankton, krills, whales, fish, marine birds. So one thing that we do know from looking at the natural site in Tonga is that the natural site in Tonga does not seem to have abnormal ecology in any way. In fact, when nature does this naturally through undersea vents, you end up with biodiversity hotspots, right? And very good fishing grounds. So it does look like it could be ecologically quite benign. It's not expensive because we're talking about very simple minerals in very low concentrations. We're not really talking about a lot of iron. We're talking about the math we've done shows that the weight of a human eyelash per ton of seawater would be enough to raise the productivity of the South Pacific to something close to what the North Atlantic has. So honestly, this to me seems like a much better conversation to be having about an actually realistic way to get to net zero within a relatively short period of time, short enough to give the world the time to decarbonize that it would need, which is on a different time scale.
And phytoplankton is not algae?
It's microalgae. It's microscopic.
Microalgae. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify, to paint a picture in people's minds, are we talking about ships or aeroplanes spraying fertilizer into the South Pacific?
But that's all to be worked out. There are lots of technical questions. So at Anthropocene, we're backing a project called Growing Oceans. You can go to growingoceans.org and see all the technical detail. All of that is still to be worked out. For example, how much iron and how much phosphate delivered how. What we need is like a 3-year research program to go to the South Pacific to understand the ecology of phytoplankton and zooplankton in the region in much more detail, and to begin maybe then, if it turns out to be ecologically safe and if the local people want it, because we're working in people's territorial waters, right? To then begin to experiment with what nutrient additions would do. So we don't know all the details. A lot of the science remains to be worked out. We just have this initial indication from nature that this could be done and this could be done in a benign way.
So part of people's reticence, I assume, when you raise this is the past examples of humans trying to introduce something into an ecosystem. Australia has a problem with a floral pest called the prickly pear. So the Hawaiians have a great idea of giving us a cane toad to eat the insect that is going to get the prickly pear. And it's just this cascade of I may be misremembering that or butchering it, but now we have an intractable pest problem where the cane toad has no natural predators. Ecosystems function in complicated ways. You have more phytoplankton. What does that do to the coral reefs? How does coral respond to the phytoplankton? Does the phytoplankton create more shade in the water so that there's less solar radiation for the fish at the bottom to get? all of these knock-on
Yeah.
effects. What do you say to people who say, like, this is not the right way? We just need to we need to reduce the carbon.
There's a couple of things about this. First, the idea is not to introduce any organism that is not naturally in the water already. It's just to feed the organisms that are in the water. And in fact, what we would be doing in many ways is just restoring the situation that we had 150 years ago. So until 150 years ago, we have good evidence that the center of ocean gyres used to be more productive than it is now. And the reason it was more productive is that we had lots of whales. Whales eat at depth where there's lots of nutrients in the water, and then they come up for air. And then when they come up for air, they tend to do a number two. Actually, whale feces turns out to be an excellent fertilizer for phytoplankton, and there's quite a bit of research.
I appreciate your politeness in calling it a number two. You can just call it a giant whale shit on this show. That's all right.
Well, that's exactly what they do. When you can actually look this up. It's called the biological pump or the whale pump, and there's very good evidence that because of the legacy of industrial whaling, oceans have lost the ability to cycle nutrients from depth to the surface where phytoplankton can grow. And that's one important reason why there is now less phytoplankton than there used to be. So we're really talking about recreating a situation that we used to have where oceans were a higher performing carbon sink than they are now. That's one thing. But the other thing to say about this is that, of course, you're right. Oceans and ecosystems are big, difficult to model, unpredictable things, which is why the project that we're backing, Growing Oceans, is being very careful to do this in a stage-gated way. So the model we have in mind is patterned on the way that drug development happens. So when you go to develop a new drug, you start with laboratory experiments and you assess for safety and efficacy. If it's safe and if it works, then you go to a small trial. And then you again assess. And if it's safe and it works, you go to a slightly larger trial. And you keep doing that. But at each point, you have a moment when you actually stop and you look at the data, and you need permission from a regulator to go forward. So, we are not crazy people. We are working with university-based ecologists who understand the issues at play. And, we don't know if it's going to work. This is an idea at this point. What we do know is that we should definitely be exploring whether this is a possibility, because this kind of approach has a potential to get us to gigaton scale carbon removal that the UN process has already shown that it does have. Right?